Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to Newsline Live. Now then, there's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ugly. No, not the film, but the counter-terrorism bill. Hopefully the thing that replaces the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Or do we need it at all? Who knows? But our guest tonight will tell us all about the good, the bad, and the ugly. The former Human Rights Commissioner of Sri Lanka and Human Rights Advocate, Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan, is our guest. Very good evening to you, Ms. Satkunanathan. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Faraz.
And tell us, why do we need special legislation when it comes to addressing terrorism?
Well, I would say right now, the question is whether we do need it. And many of us would argue that we do not, because the current legal framework as it exists does enable investigations into such crimes, prosecutions, etc. So we would argue that there is no need for such legislation. The government, on the other hand, argues that there is a need. So I think we need to look at this law very carefully to see what it contains, to understand whether we need it or not, and see the rationale behind the argument that we do not.
And what is terrorism? Is it defined?
Well, that's the thing. Internationally, there isn't a UN convention-based definition. Usually, international definitions to be accepted are part of UN conventions that most countries sign up to. They ratify it, which means through ratification, they accept that. Now, we do not have that for terrorism, but at the United Nations, there is an ongoing process to draft such a definition. There is a draft, but it has not been agreed upon. Mm-hmm. So in the absence of that, Faraz, we do have a current formulation that is accepted. That has three elements. The elements are offences that cause a death or serious bodily injury, or taking of hostages, that are committed with the intention of provoking a state of terror amongst the public, or to force a government to do something or to not to do something. And the third element of this is that it should be an offense that is defined in both in international protocols as terrorism. So you can't have just one element. You must have all three. If we look at the new anti-terrorism bill, you do not have that. What you have are vague definitions, overbroad definitions that are parts of the formulation that I just explained to you, but not all. They have things like, and I want to get it right, acts such as violating territorial integrity or infringement of sovereignty of Sri Lanka or any other sovereign country. They have what we currently have in the ICCPR Act, which is propagating war, advocating national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Now, that already exists in the ICCPR Act, and that has often been used against writers, poets like Arnaf Jazim, like Shaktika Saktumara. It has been used against them to imprison them. So law that was supposed to protect Sri Lankan citizens has been used by successive governments against them. Now what they have done is that they've taken that from the ICCPR Act, they've included it in this bill, and they've elevated it to terrorism, which means that makes all of us actually more insecure, because what we have seen is the state in Sri Lanka abuse laws that are supposed to protect citizens. So how can we then trust the state to have so much power and not abuse human rights?
Thank you for your questions, by the way. 0772 300 305. There's a question that was sent out a little bit earlier. I think it's referring to the counterterrorism bill, and it says here, how can the Attorney General undertake that His Excellency the President would not implement the death penalty?
What do you mean? How can he? He gave an
Apparently
undertaking
he gave an undertaking
on
to the
behalf
Supreme.
of the. That's right,
So
of
he-
the president.
So he's obviously acting on the instructions. Of the president.
Absolutely, absolutely, of course, acting on the
Is
instructions.
that the proper procedure? He doesn't the president have to write it in?
Because the action was against the president at that time, Maithripala Sirisena, who was going to implement the death penalty, and several fundamental rights petitions were filed against that. And it was at the conclusion of that, it was when it was taken up at the Supreme Court, that the Attorney General provided an undertaking on behalf of the state that they would not go ahead with executions. Now, a good thing you raised that, Faraz, because in this new anti-terrorism bill, currently in the Prevention of Terrorism Act, we do not have the death penalty. But in this counter-terrorism bill, we do have the death penalty. We have the death sentence for the offense of murder. So once again, that is a regression, because globally we see countries are abolishing the death penalty. Sri Lanka has a moratorium on the death penalty. We've had it since 1976. And therefore, this is another regression where we've seen the death penalty also being included in this new draft legislation.
But the fact that they've included it in this bill suggests that they seem to be unaware of this moratorium.
Well, it appears that way, because there's also a section here that says when someone is sentenced, that until the appeal is heard, that the execution or the of the sentence will not take place. 2 points to note. Anyway, when you appeal, the sentence is not implemented until the appeal is concluded. And secondly, we do have a moratorium, so you can't actually implement it. And now, in addition to that, the Attorney General has turned up in Supreme Court, provided an undertaking they won't. So maybe the drafters of the bill appear to be unaware of those facts.
But it certainly does appear that way. What's the link between corruption and terrorism then?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question. There can be, there isn't an obvious link, and I'm not quite sure how that relates.
Perhaps the viewer who sent that in will be a bit more
Provide
precise.
some clarification?
Yes, be a bit more precise, like the need, as you said earlier, to precisely define terrorism. Regionally, how does it compare, this law? Well, we had the PTA, or we have it, and now the proposed counter-terrorism. What other countries in the region have this?
Well, actually, even in India, they do have appalling laws.
Okay.
But that does not mean that because in the region you have countries that do not have laws that protect human rights, that have laws that violate international human rights standards, that have appalling counterterrorism or anti-terror law, that we need to follow suit. If at all, I think we should take the lead in having progressive legislation. Because if you see, for us, in the bill, there are various things. Like, for instance, you can declare any place, the president has the power to declare any place a prohibited place.
Right.
Which means that, and this is done on the recommendation of the IGP, or it can be on one of the commanders of the tri-forces. So
Right.
it means a place that is commonly used to protest, like Lipton Circus or like Golface, can be declared a prohibited place. And after that, the officer who is put in charge of that place can make decisions on the spot, arbitrary, spur of the moment, no objective factors taken into account to decide, okay, I will decide who gets to go to the place, who we ban from the place.
But where's the check and balance then?
Exactly, there is no check and balance. And for how long can you continue declaring a place a prohibited place? Right? So there are various elements like that in this law which can also affect people's right to protest, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly.
Thank you again for your questions, but let me just go to another one that we had. How in Sri Lanka, we'll take that question first then. Are there any good points about this counter-terrorism bill?
Well, see, what it does is it's a very smart drafting in a way, because when you see it affirms certain due process rights. So it says that when you're arrested, that your family has to be given an arrest receipt, that you have to be given a copy of the detention order, that even when you're on a detention order, a magistrate has to visit you once in 2 weeks, that if the magistrate finds that you are being tortured, have to produce you before a judicial medical officer, etc., etc. So those that you need, that you should be provided a translator, that a woman should be checked in by only a woman officer, etc. But those processes are there. But the fact is, it isn't very different from the PTA, because one very problematic aspect of the PTA is not here, which is admissibility of confessions given to police officers as evidence. That isn't here. But we do have detention orders, and worse, under the PTA, it's the Minister of Defense that can issue it. Here, it is a DIG. So the power to detain you for up to 3 months initially is given to a DIG. Do you want that? Would citizens be okay with that? And
so what's the role of the magistrate in this case?
So in this case, what happens is a detention order is issued, and the magistrate merely gives effect to it. So the magistrate or the judiciary becomes a rubber stamping entity here, rather than someone who decides whether the detention order should be issued or not. When the detention order comes to an end at the 3 months, the police then submits a confidential report. It isn't actually said whether the arrested person and their lawyer can have access to this report. And the proceedings are also held in camera. So they produce this report to the judge, and they request the person to be detained for a further 3 months. The judge can review that report, and if the judge feels that the person should not, that he or she should not issue another detention order for another 3 months, then the judge is required by this law to inquire from the police officer whether the person should be remanded. Now, if there isn't a reason to detain the person on a detention order, what reason would there be to detain the person on remand in prison, right? Because clearly there isn't evidence. No, one more thing. If they feel that there isn't any reason...
There seems to be many problems with the counter-terrorism bill. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in conversation with Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan, who is a human rights advocate. Please carry on. What are the further dodgy things that are embedded in this bill?
No, in that part of it. So if the magistrate then decides that there isn't reason to, if there isn't reason to detain the person on remand, that is, remand means judicial custody in prison, then the magistrate can release the person on bail. But if there isn't evidence to detain the person on a detention order, if there isn't evidence to detain the person on remand, in judicial custody, why not discharge the person? Why on bail? So you can see how this law, at every point the magistrate is there, but at every point they make it difficult for a person to be released. And even when it seems that there is no evidence, there is somehow a way of keeping the person still entrapped in the judicial process.
So what you're really saying is that appearance-wise, the magistrate is always there, but in actual practice is not there.
Well, exactly. The magistrate is there, but how much power does the magistrate have? Can the magistrate make decisions, or is it actually the police making decisions and giving the appearance or that it has been given over to the judicial authority? So it is actually quite insidious.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are in conversation with Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan, human rights advocate, and it's now time, we'll come back and discuss this further, but it's now time to take a peek at this evening's primetime news headlines, and we'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
Fuel prices to reduce with effect from midnight. Bus and three-wheeler fares also to reduce. Petroleum trade unions continue strike. Police, army and employees deployed for distribution. striking petroleum workers, including SLPP trade union leader, sent on compulsory leave.
කනගාටු වෙන කියන්න පොදු ජන පෙරමුණේ වෘත්තීය සමිතියේ ප්‍රධානියෙක් පවා මේ කටයුත්තේ ඉන්නවා.
Gotabaya failed and Ranil fulfilled expectations, says SLPP General Secretary.
අපි එතුමාගෙන් පළවෙනි ඉල්ලීම කරේ මේ රටේ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදය ආරක්ෂා කරලා දෙන්න එතුමා ඒක උදා කරලා දුන්නා.
President hints at new direction once the economy is stabilized with the support of the IMF in 4 years. Will Harsha, Iran and Kabir defect to the government?
ඒක හරි නැමතුමාගෙන් අහන්න වෙනවා.
ඔබතුමා හිතනවාද අර ආර්ෂා දෙසිල්වා හරි කබීර් රජිම හරි මම හරි රාජපක්ෂ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවක් ඒ වවට අත උස්සයි කියලා?
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with Ambika Satkunanathan, former Human Rights Commissioner at the HRCSL and a human rights advocate. Ms. Satkunanathan, in this proposed bill, it says that the President has the power to prescribe if he has reasonable grounds. What on earth is reasonable grounds? And technically, is he then able to prescribe the opposition, the principal opposition party, whoever it is?
Well, here it is troubling because it says that the president can prescribe organizations on the recommendation of the IGP or the government that and has reasonable grounds to believe the organization is engaged in an act amounting to an offense under the proposed law.
But
right?
if in this country, at the current moment, when there's a big question mark over the independent commissions, the president clearly, all of these appointments are heavily politicized. So technically, the president can have his own IGP, and then he would then go hand in hand with what the president says and go ahead and prescribe any organization that the president wants.
But it's not just that. The fact is that it's just on this recommendation. There is no judicial oversight. There is no judicial process. There is no transparency on the reasons. And they can prohibit. Now, if you take an institution like even the IUSF, they can prescribe them. And the prescription order is for 1 year, but it can be extended by a year for infinity. There is no maximum number of times it can be extended. It can prevent them from having activities, from giving membership or taking on new members. So it is very dangerous because the executive is given these broad, unchecked powers, and there is very little way in which you can challenge this except in the court of appeal. Therefore, this once again, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, protest, right to protest, it adversely impacts all that. And in Sri Lanka, we have seen the executive. It's a all-powerful executive, and we have seen the executive abuse that power repeatedly. So, do we want to give this kind of power to the president?
And further sort of concern arises with the role of the military as proposed in this counter-terrorism bill. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yes, I can. The PTA at the moment, there is no involvement of the military. But in the anti-terrorism bill, and like in even the counter-terrorism bill that the Yahapalana government put forward, the military is given powers to perform law and order functions, so they can arrest someone. After they arrest someone, they have 24 hours to hand the person to police custody. And also they can stop and search any vessel, any vehicle. And this is very worrying because this is militarizing of policing, and it is normalizing the militarization of policing. Usually it is only when a state of emergency is declared or the president uses section 12 of the Public Security Ordinance to call out the armed forces to maintain public order. Once again, that is an abuse of the power of the executive, and even President Ranil Wickremesinghe has been doing that every month. But here what they're doing is they're normalizing everything by including it in this law.
I'm seriously wondering if these legislators have got nothing better to do, and that they're doing these sort of things rather than getting on with getting their act together in terms of our economy. But I suppose the law is also important. What about rehabilitation? What about drug addicts and so on?
Well, I mean, in relation to that, or are we talking
No,
generally?
just let's go rehabilitation first.
In relation to this, well,
Yes.
here also it does give the Attorney General the power to defer prosecution if the person agrees to go for rehabilitation. And we passed in January the Bureau of Rehabilitation Bill. Now, as it stands, the Bureau of Rehabilitation Bill is for persons with drug dependency, but it also has this phrase, or any other person.
Indeed.
So they can, through this law, and they can pass regulations to make it applicable to other people. Now, the history of Sri Lanka has shown, whether it was after the end of the war, when there were, 12,000 persons who were supposedly rehabilitated, but the fact is there were various violations that took place, and people who were not active combatants and were not deemed combatants under international humanitarian law were all sent to these centers where they were arbitrarily detained. And
so really, Ms. Satkunanathan, isn't the real concern isn't it that Sri Lanka doesn't seem to have a robust, balanced judiciary? Isn't that what it is? And an implementation. We have policemen who are corrupt. The whole system basically stinks. And therefore, to try and put these things where you give people like the DIG the power to issue a DO would be perhaps acceptable if everything else was equal.
But I think
this is all
even then
unequal.
it is not, because the deprivation of a person's liberty is something that should be taken very seriously, but isn't. When a person can be detained for 1 year, up to a year on a detention order, people here don't seem to take it seriously. But it is extremely serious. And even if all things were perfect, that is really not the power that should be given to a DIG of police.
Going back, thank you for that question. Going back to this, the powers of the president on reasonable grounds to proscribe any organization, would that necessarily include political parties, is the question coming back, and perhaps media organizations, organizations that they just don't like?
Well, the fact is it shouldn't. And if you look at legal
Yes, so where
principles,
is the
etc.
counter
But the
to
fact
that?
is we don't know. In Sri Lanka, we have seen historically laws being abused any which way. So if you do have an authoritarian government with absolutely no respect for the rule of law, then laws can be abused. We really can't say they won't be. But they shouldn't be, even the way that it is, it's constructed. But this, as I said, there isn't oversight. There isn't transparency in this process. There isn't judicial involvement. So we don't know exactly why they are being proscribed.
In its present state, do you think that there's a case for the Supreme Court to look at it?
Well, what the process is according to the Constitution, they've gazetted it.
Yeah.
But then after that, they have to place it on the order paper of Parliament.
Yeah.
Once it's placed on the order paper of Parliament, then you have, according to the Constitution, 14 days in which you
Yes,
can
I know.
challenge the bill in the Supreme Court. So I would say, yeah, definitely, once they place it on the order paper, given that it is such appalling legislation, I would say you can expect many challenges.
So the work of the Supreme Court's already been cut out,
Well, exactly.
or adding to their already heavy schedule. What about the police? Does this bill in a way then dilute policing? Because if this bill is going to deal with counter-terrorism and gets the military involved, it means the role of the police is somewhat reduced then.
Not really. I mean, it is the DIG who issues it. The person will be kept in police. The detention order is issued for him to be kept, the person to be kept in police.
So does this mean that the military and the police can arrest
Absolutely,
people?
exactly. It means the military and the police. Once the military arrests someone, they have 24 hours to hand them over to police custody. Firstly, the military should not be arresting people because really that's not the role of a military in a democracy, not law and order.
My mind simply goes back to the Velikada prison riot, where the military got involved, whereas if it was left to the prisoners, the prison warders, to handle their charges, they know how to handle with them. The minute the military came in, everything, all hell broke loose.
Well, it was, I mean, different elements got involved in the Velikada also, as the judgment, the High Court, the judgment says of the case. But also we have seen even during the Aragalaya how the military was brought in. The July 22nd, early morning, we saw the military breaking up GGG, Gota Gogama, and the brutality. There are video evidence, there's video evidence of the brutality with which they broke up GGG and the violence used on the people there. It was not in self-defense. It was even chasing people and assaulting them. So clearly that is not, simply put, it's not the role of the military in a democracy. We seem to have forgotten that. We call ourselves, one of the oldest democracies in the region, but we seem to have forgotten the basic element of what constitutes a democracy, the role each of these institutions play or should play in a democracy.
How does the new law compare with similar counter-terrorism legislation, say in the UK or the USA, specifically in the areas of concern already raised?
Well, I mean, in some countries, yes, they do have appalling laws, like, for instance, even in the United States, they do have. But in Europe, the period of detention in many countries, it's like for a week. But even for a week, it was considered too much, and there were protests in different countries. So my point is, most of the countries are prone to passing legislation to restrict the rights of citizens, regrettably. We do see, it was mentioned even at the Amnesty International report launch yesterday, how there seems to be a growing authoritarian club where these authoritarian leaders are coming to power through technically democratic means like elections, and they're learning from each other on how to erode democratic values and violate the rights of citizens with impunity.
And thank you very much for your question. 0772 300 305. We're about to finish, but Ms. Satkunanathan, do you think this bill is to safeguard the rulers post-Aragalaya and not to safeguard the people?
Well, it's not just about the Aragalaya, because, struggles in Sri Lanka precede the Aragalaya. There have been people protesting. Now, if you take the PTA, for instance, it was used against the Tamil community for decades. And university students, young persons were targeted, ended up in prison, tortured, without being tried for years. Therefore, I think it is about not just the Aragalaya, it is about an abusive state structure where abuse, use of violence with impunity is entrenched, and successive governments that have come to power have also been that way. And hence, it's about the state always trying to restrict the rights of citizens, because the state and the governments that come to power do not want to be held accountable.
And how confident are you that the government of the day will listen and perhaps amend the bill accordingly before it finally becomes law?
Well, let's put it this way. We had the Yahapalana government also. This is Yahapalana on the CTA is what the Yahapalana government put forward. This is CTA on steroids. Large parts of the anti-terrorism bill are exactly like the counter-terrorism bill that were put forward by Yahapalana government, which was more progressive. Therefore, I think it is about the fact that most of the governments that come to power by nature, it seems they want to retain or claim more power than they should have. So all that we can say is that citizens should realize that this is not targeted just at particular groups that you think are, like the protesters or like the IUSF, who are causing disruption, etc. But this is law that can be used against anyone.
Ambika Satkunanathan, thank you very much for being on Newsline Live, as always. And ladies and gentlemen, just to remind you, tomorrow we have a special program, and it's called Unafraid and Unbowed and Unafraid. The Lasanta Vikramatunga story, the new book launched by his wife, Rain Vikramatunga. Don't forget to catch it same time at 8:30 p.m. And it's now time for the primetime news. So, as always, let's wish you a very good evening as much as you can, and of course, God bless you all.